Yes, hello, it's me, Alex, known lover of games I don't remotely have time for. You know what I love and don't have time for? Fire Emblem. 50 hours to beat one route? Get out of here, who the hell has time to play that much video game? But recently, I've been playing a Fire Emblem-like that I can't stop putting down, and I promise it's far more accessible. As I've gotten into before, I love to see this highly specific tradition of strategy game meet visual novel proliferate despite its incredibly unhealthy runtime. In this case, Symphony of War is a little bit more strategy game and a little less highly charged narrative about anime boys and girls you love axe murdering in an active war zone. The narrative's perfectly functional, but the big personalities take a bit of a backseat to far more granular and interesting army building. You know, mainly because you get to lead an actual army and not just 12 teenagers. Symphony of War's big twist is that instead of fielding single soldiers, every unit is an entire squad that you yourself build, with each individual character in that squad having its own stats, class, strengths, and weaknesses. This might sound incredibly fiddly and complicated, but as we're going to get into, the way Symphony of War's team building elements are designed paradoxically makes it one of the easiest tactics games to just jump into and start having fun. Because this one hits the ground running. As always, I'm Alex, and this is First 5, where I ask if games are worth your time, not your money. I played a game for 5 hours, and I'm gonna tell you if those were 5 hours well spent. And today we're raising a grand army from scratch in Symphony of War, the Nephilim Saga. Symphony of War is not what you'd normally expect to find on this channel. It advertises itself as a 40-hour game. Once you get into it, its maps are pretty extensive 40-minute slugfests, and you've got incredibly crunchy gameplay that has you trying to min-max and personalize hundreds of different units. This isn't something you look at and immediately think, oh yeah, that's First 5 material right there. But one thing I'm always looking for is a game that can compress a long and unwieldy experience into something much more compact and actually digestible for people that have things like a job, or, you know, kids, and don't want to take a year to finish the damn thing. And even if it's still a little on the long side, Symphony of War does exactly that, especially if all you're familiar with is the modern Fire Emblem experience. There's a full 5-minute pedantic nerd sermon that most people absolutely don't want to hear about why this is, but a major contributor is the fact that Symphony of War allows you to start diversifying and tweaking your army as early as after your very first mission. One of the best parts of these tactics games, especially the old-school Fire Emblem games Symphony of War takes so much inspiration from, is their almost roguelike quality to allow you to mold an army over time into something that reflects your own aesthetic and playstyle. Fire Emblem, taken as just a tactics game with no outside elements, is honestly pretty standard, even rudimentary fare, but every action on the field is complicated by that team-building metagame. Whether you're trying to preserve a choice unit from the ravages of its permadeath system, or trying to build up a specific character, Fire Emblem asks you to purposely play sub-optimally in order to further your long-term goals in building your stable of powerhouse characters. That push and pull between those two priorities, between the short-term goal of actually beating a given level and the long-term goal of efficiently developing your army, is the true mechanical heart of what makes these games sing. And this is why Symphony of War just absolutely rips, because this game's team-building elements dominate it. While Fire Emblem usually wants you to wait a good 20 hours before you really get to start messing with your characters, Symphony of War lets you make those choices constantly, the entire time you're playing it, from the very first hour. Taking a page from Tactics Ogre, Symphony of War doesn't ask you to field individual knights and mages, but instead entire units that can fit up to 9 people, but in the early game mostly just consist of 4 or 5. So when you start out the game, you already have a good 30 moving pieces to play with, each of which is constantly leveling up, can change classes to fill specialized roles on the battlefield, and can have their stats tweaked by items. Even though your soldiers move around in squads, almost everything is tracked on an individual basis, which can lead to really cool unit compositions that mix different classes together, or situations where a unit loses 1 or 2 soldiers in a battle that now suddenly need to be replaced with fresh recruits that need to be trained up to the rest of the unit. Now, all of that probably sounds a little overwhelming to just get dropped right into, but thankfully, it isn't nearly as complicated as it might sound at first. The game handles its pacing quite well, and after any given battle, you'll only have a half dozen decisions at most to make about how to develop your army. You'll maybe have 2 characters to choose a new class for, a new unit to build, 1 or 2 items to allocate, and the game's randomly generated market might have a juicy new unit for you to slot into the army somewhere. Altogether, once you've gone through the process once or twice, it's a pretty manageable system. The only way in which Symphony of War's team building feels a little unintuitive is with its UI, which takes a lot more time to get used to than the actual mechanics themselves. The menus are fairly burdensome to navigate, and the entire game is crying out for literally any pop-up tooltips. After my time with the game, I've mostly worked my way through those issues and I'm a lot more comfortable with it, but the UI is the sole factor in the game that makes it feel particularly unwelcoming for newcomers. All of that said, once these units hit the actual tactical field, they play pretty similarly to any other tactics game. But there is one real standout in the way that different units interact with each other. Instead of a formalized system of rock, paper, scissors where certain units just mathematically do better against specific opponents, Symphony of War's units all have natural interactions that arise from their particular quirks to create a more complex but immediately intuitive web of natural counters. You start with heavy infantry, your standard load-bearing unit that you can slap on basically anything. They provide a solid, beefy wall to keep more fragile units like a swordswoman or a mage safe, but their actual utility beyond that is fairly limited. And while they're self-sufficient and capable of weathering any frontal assault, heavy infantry melt under ranged fire. So if you get a unit of archers in there, they're going to ruin a heavy infantry unit's day. But then you introduce healing characters, which in turn naturally counter archers. Because archers tend to spread a lot of damage around an entire unit without actually killing anything, a unit with 2 healers can erase almost any progress those archers make. But you know what can pick off a healer? Rogues, who specifically have a trait where they attack the back rank of a squad instead of the front, and are fantastic at cleaning up healers or other squishy nuisances. But rogues have no defenses themselves, and so we come full circle to heavy infantry, which become the bane of their existence because they can survive long enough to punch back. What you get is a system that functions very similarly to Fire Emblem's Holy Trinity, but feels more satisfying because it's rooted in the actual tactical traits of how each individual unit works. And because all of these different traits are rooted in real-world feeling logic and play out consistently, the entire system still feels quite intuitive and almost like it wordlessly teaches itself. Again, that all might sound a little complicated, but each of these units gets slowly doled out one at a time. There are all kinds of different synergies to explore, especially once you can start mix and matching multiple classes into the same unit, and the game does a great job at slowly building them up over time and cluing the player into its many tactical wrinkles. And man, what a glorious melee it all builds to. Symphony of War does a fantastic job selling the epic scale of its central civil war, primarily through its level design. Symphony of War's battles get pretty big. At the point I'm at, battles have me playing around with 15 whole units, and with each unit being composed of multiple combatants, you're throwing like 100 people onto the field. And in a very neat flourish, the geography of each level recognizably matches the actual world map. When you step out onto a battlefield in Symphony of War, you're not simply getting into some dust-up between a dozen people in some random hills. You're slugging it out with hundreds of soldiers across an entire dukedom you recognize. This scale is a big reason why Symphony of War's stages can start to get a bit long as you get deeper in, but I wouldn't change it for the world. Not just because it gives you that sense of epic scope, but also because you get to use every tool in your arsenal almost every fight. A lot of similar games in this field often purposely give you up to double the characters you can actually deploy, partially so you have backups for when you screw up and a character runs afoul of the game's permadeath. But leaving half my special anime boys at home every fight has always felt a little unsatisfying for me. Thankfully, there are no such issues here. Symphony of War accelerates at such a ridiculous pace that it's actually difficult to keep up and fill out a full army. All that time I spent rambling about the game's amazing team-building elements, all the tweaking and decisions you make as you slowly build up your army, all those cool toys you've been slowly nurturing the entire game, you don't have to leave any of it behind. When you hit the tactical map, Symphony of War actually lets you bring every last iota of might you've built up to bear. And that is a great feeling. But alright, time for the big question. What do you get out of 5 hours with Symphony of War? This game has a pretty steadily escalating power curve, starting with small engagements with only a handful of limited units, all the way up to massive battles between hundreds of soldiers. The 5-hour mark is pretty much where that curve begins to flatten, the game's firing on all cylinders, and you start getting those huge engagements. But while a lot of that time is tutorialization in hindsight, those first 5 hours are still incredibly engaging on a first run. And as I've already brought up a few times, Symphony of War excels at giving you interesting decisions to make right away from the very start, especially when it comes to its team building mechanics. This game might have a longer runtime than what I typically look for, but its early game is surprisingly rewarding and can stand on its own. You might have noticed, however, that I've pretty much entirely skipped talking about anything outside of the gameplay, and frankly, that's because all of it is just fine. The soundtrack's got an occasional banger, the art holds up reasonably well, and the narrative is perfectly middle of the road. This is solid 7 out of 10 stuff here. It'll do very little to offend, but it's not really what to come to the game for. Frankly, there's just not a lot to say about it all one way or the other. But the gameplay? Oh man, the gameplay absolutely slaps. This is a wonderful little tactics gem with some fantastic crunch to it, just phenomenal to explore and master. I'm having a ton of fun with Symphony of War, and if you're looking for a crunchy tactics game that gives you something satisfying to play with right up front, this is gonna be your jam. So that's Symphony of War in a nutshell. I think you should give it a look, and if you've got some spare cash after that and like this video, consider hitting up my Patreon, because I too need to eat and would very much appreciate the tip. But I hope you enjoyed this review of Symphony of War, and I'll see you all next time.